We are now on to Chapter 6, the concept of relationship and relationship between categorical variables. So we're leaving univariate statistics and we're on to bivariate descriptive statistics. Bivariate statistics is one and the same as exploring relationship between two variables, and that's what we're up to now. We did talk about relationship in Chapter 1. Your intuitive sense of what relationship is on target. The intuitive meaning of relationship is that particular values of one variable tend to go with particular values of another. So suppose that you have two variables, political party and support, yes versus no, for legislation X. Well then, if 80% of Democrats but only 10% of Republicans support legislation X, then the value Democrat is tending to go with the value supports. And looked at differently, the value Republican goes much less often with support for legislation X and much more often with voting against legislation X. So I'm still sticking with an intuitive definition of relationship. The values of one variable, if the values of one variable differ, vary, or change according to those of the other, that's also getting at the notion of relationship. So for instance, if as hours studied increases, students tend to get better and better grades on a test, then hours studied and grade earned on the test are related, or we can equally well say associated. Here's a definition of relationship that's more formal. Some values of one variable tend to occur more often with some values of the second variable than with other values of that second variable. So if, for instance, women are more likely than men to eat salads rather than burgers for lunch, we can say that gender and lunch are related. And so the notion is the value salads, we could say, tends to occur more often if we have a woman, and the value burger tends to go with male. So there we have relationship. And I mean, think of an example used in Chapter 1. Height and being tall tend to go together. Tall occurs more often with male. Shorter, relatively speaking, occurs more often than female. So there again, and this is sort of both the intuitive and formal notion of relationship, gender and height are associated. And let me just quickly give you an example of a situation where there's the absence of relationship, where in essence there's no tendency of some values to go with other values. So suppose we examine the relationship or lack thereof between eye color, brown, green, blue, gray, other, etc., and a grade earned on a statistics test. Say the numeric grades, which may be spanned from 60 to 100 on a given test. Well, if there's no relationship between eye color and grade earned on the test, then that means that those with different eye colors tend to score in similar pattern. You know, it's not that everybody with brown eyes and blue eyes and green eyes gets exactly the same score, but that we have no pairing amongst the overall scores for those groups. So the idea would be, say, that basically the mean score on the test for brown and blue and green and gray eyes, those mean scores for each group tend to be very, very similar or the same. So then there's no pattern of eye color going with, say, more often high, medium, or low stats grades, but rather eye color and stats grade in essence occur independently of one another. We have people of differing eye colors being in essence equally likely to earn high, medium, or low grades on our stats test. Now let's take a look at some situations that are not connected with the study of relationship. Suppose that you see this, that on legislation Z, 44% of Republicans vote yes and 56% of Republicans vote no. And then the question on the exam is posed to you: are political party affiliation and vote on legislation Z associated? The problem with this trick question is that we have only one variable. So vote on Z does indeed vary. Some legislators vote yes and some vote no. On the other hand, our second, I put this in parentheses, political party, our second variable isn't a variable, but instead, as defined here, our second variable is a constant. So if you read the information above here, everyone in the sample is a Republican. Everyone's Republican, so political party is a constant. It's not a variable. So our exam question makes no sense because one needs two variables to have the possibility of relationship. So now let's examine a different situation. 72% of Democrats vote yes on Z versus 24% of Republicans. Now we do have two variables. Political party, Democratic or Republican, vote on Z, yes or no. As we have two variables, now we can assess whether there is or is not a relationship. We look at our data and we do see that Democrats are more likely than Republicans to vote yes. So we have this notion of tending to go together, which is at the essence of relationship. And so we see Democrats tending more often, or we can say more often voting yes than Republicans. So values of Democrat tend to be paired with yes and values of Republican with no. And so in this example we have association, same thing as relationship between political party and vote on Z. Now to have a relationship between two variables, we need to have in essence what you could think of as only a pattern. And what I mean to say more specifically is for two variables to be related, it need not be the case that all cases in one group are in one category and all cases in another group are in a different one. For instance, for there to be relationship between smoking and lung cancer, it need not be the case that all smokers develop lung cancer and all non-smokers not develop lung cancer. We don't have to have perfect grouping of values of one variable and values of another. We simply need to have patterns. So if we have the situation that smokers and non-smokers are not equally likely to develop lung cancer, which is to say that smokers more often than non-smokers develop lung cancer, differing percentages of smokers and non-smokers develop lung cancer. Well, that's sufficient for there to be relationship. We need to find that tending to go together, that pattern. Let me clarify a couple of points about relationship and also about what this chapter is going to cover. Chapter 1 briefly discussed that not all relationships are causal. In other words, you can have relationship between two variables even though neither one is affecting, which is to say causing, the other. Now the key reason that we see association in the absence of cause is the presence of confounding variables. So that in New York City, as our example from Chapter 1 went, talked about the relationship between ice cream consumption and burglary rates. And indeed, there is a relationship. On hotter days, people eat more ice cream. And on hotter days, there's increased opportunity for burglary. So the confounding variable, temperature, brings about and is responsible for the relationship between ice cream consumption and burglary rates. So for this chapter, we're not going to be concerned about the cause of relationship. I mean, we're just simply going to be studying how do we determine whether there is relationship? And also another question is, how do we determine how strong a relationship might be? We're not going to discuss what's bringing about the relationship. So, it is indeed correct to say there's relationship between ice cream consumption and burglary in New York. In this case, that relationship is due to a confounding variable. In other situations that we'll study, we'll have relationship, and the relationship will indeed be causal. In still other situations, we won't be able to determine assuredly whether the relationship is causal. But the question of causality doesn't come up in this chapter and the next three. We talk about causality in depth in Chapter 10. Now, Chapter 1 also talked about relationships occurring in random samples simply due to the luck of the draw. So the example from Chapter 1 in essence said, suppose there's no relationship between gender and vegetarianism in a university population, but now suppose we select random samples of women and men from that university, and then indeed we find that differing percentages of women and men are vegetarian in our samples. So this is the business that, again, relationship in a sample doesn't allow you to conclude assuredly that in the population from which those random samples have been selected, there's also relationship. Now, statistical significance studies this issue. In other words, it examines how plausible is it that the relationship that we see in our random sample, or random samples we could say, is due simply to the luck of the draw of random samples, which is to say, simply due to chance. So, we get relationships in samples sometimes simply due to the luck of the draw. In chapters 6 through 9, which are examining relationship, we're not going to be concerned about whether a relationship is statistically significant or not. That discussion takes up most of the second half of the text. Past 15 minutes or so have been an introduction to the concept of relationship between variables, this general notion of values tending to occur together. What we're going to do now is talk about how do you measure relationship between categorical variables. We're always going to be dealing with two variables at a time. So one tool for doing so is contingency table analysis, oftentimes called crosstabs. Two variables are presented in the contingency table. As you'll see on the next slide, the column variable defines the columns. The row variable defines the rows. And this text follows a convention. And this is not a convention that holds in contingency tables and other very similar tables that you'll see as you read the literature. But in this text, I always make the independent variable, the one presumably doing the affecting, I always make that the column variable. and I always make the dependent variable, the one that is affected, the one that is caused by the other, I always make that one the row variable. So here you have an example of a contingency table, and there's lots and lots of terms on this table. So let me just do the best I can at walking you through them, and I'll hope that I don't forget one. So you can see here we have two variables. One is, we'll call one type of adoption. We'll call the other adoption outcome. Type of adoption has two values: adoption by new homes, which is to say not by a foster parent, and foster family adoptions. And then adoption can have two outcomes. The adoptive placement can disrupt, which is to say the child will be returned to the authority of the child welfare agency, or secondly, the adoption will work out. That is, the child will remain in the home and the adoption will be intact. So, I mean, this is an example from a child welfare related example. Type of adoption is our column variable. So to speak, its values are the two columns. So here's one value in the first column, here's a second value in the second. Adoption outcome is our row variable. So disrupted defines this first row, and stable defines the contingency table's second row. And do picture just for a second that indeed type of adoption is our independent variable. So in other words, type of adoption can presumably affect or possibly affect adoption outcome. So our independent is defining the columns, and it's our column variable, and our dependent variable defines the rows. Let's talk some about numbers. So in a contingency table, the sample size is down in the right corner of the contingency table. So here our sample size, symbolized by n, is 150. Now here is another frequency, and this is in essence a row total. So it is the case that we have 10 new home adoptions and 5 foster home adoptions, so these sum to the row total of 15. And the row total for stable adoptions, 90 plus 45, sums to our row total of 135. Note that we sum the row totals and they sum to the total sample size of 150. The numbers at the bottom of the table are our column totals. So we have a total of 100 new home adoptions in our sample, and that includes 10 that disrupted plus 90 which were stable, which sum to 100. Here are the sums that make up the 50 foster family adoptions. 5 disruptions, 45 stable adoptions, a column total of 50, and indeed observe that the column totals also sum to the sample size of 150. Now the boxed in areas of the contingency table are termed cells. So for instance, here's one cell, here is another cell. This cell is referencing disrupted adoptions by foster families. The information in this cell pertains to that. Now, what we were looking at before were the margins of the contingency table. So the numbers to the right are in the margins. That's basically the right margin, and then the numbers below the boxed in areas, that would be our bottom margin. So with the main area of the table is comprises cells, and then outside of these boxed in areas we have our margins. Let's go ahead and go inside the boxed area. Let's go inside the upper left cell, the cell pertaining to new home adoptions that disrupt. The number at the top of this cell is a cell frequency, which is simply a count of the cases in that cell. So in this table there are a total of 10 cases that are new home adoptions which disrupt. And as another example of a cell frequency, for instance, there are 45 foster family adoptions that are stable. And let me mention quickly again that cell frequencies sum respectively to row totals and to column totals. So for instance, going down the new home adoption column, the cell frequencies 10 and 90 sum to the column total of 100. The percentages inside each cell are cell percentages. And this particular contingency table has two types of cell percentages. It has column percentages and row percentages. The top percentages in each cell are our column percentages, which is to say, these are the percentages that sum to 100 down the columns. So in the new home adoption column, 10% plus 90% sums to 100%. Because these percentages sum to 100 down the column, they are column percentages. In this contingency table, the bottom percentages in each cell are row percentages. And row percentages sum to 100 across the rows. So here we have 67% plus 33%. That sums to 100% across the disrupted row, and therefore it is a row percentage. Well, here's a little more information on cell percentages. The definition of a column percentage is the percentage of a column cell column's cases that are in a cell. Where does this 10% come from? Where does this column percentage come from? Well, there are 100 cases in the column. 10 of those cases result in disruption. What percentage of the column's cases are in this top cell? So we take 10, we divide by the column total, then multiply it by 100 to convert to a percentage, and that is our 10%. And again, you see the summing to 100 down the column, which defines this as a column percentage. So here's a look at row percentage, the percentage of a row's cases that are in a cell. Where, for instance, does this 67% come from? Where does this where does this cell's row percentage come from? Well, we have 15 cases in the row. 10 of those cases are in the new home adoption cell. So we take 10 and divide by the row margin total. 10 divided by 15, multiply times 100. 67% of cases in this row are in the new home cell. That's the computation, and eyeball the percentage. In other words, look at the bottom percents. See that these bottom percents are summing to 100 across the row. then that tells you that these are row percentages. Now, it's important that you see that relationship between variables in a contingency table is assessed using cell percentages, not cell frequencies. Now, I'll just cheat and cut to the chase. I mean, the basic gist of the matter is going to be when percentages are the same, that's an absence of association, and when percentages differ, there is association. Now, the question comes up, which percentages should you focus on in assessing relationship in a contingency table? Should you focus on column percentages, or on the other hand, should you focus on row percentages? I'll just say that there's not a 100% clear answer to this. In the final analysis, one could do either, but straightforwardly, pragmatically, intuitively, in a way that'll help you understand, in a way that'll help you communicate. I mean, there is going to be one set of percentages that's going to much better convey relationship than the other. So here is our guideline for most effectively representing the relationship, or it may be the absence thereof. So if the independent variable is the column variable, the recommendation is compare column percentages. If the independent variable is the row variable, you should compare row percentages. This text follows the convention, as mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, that the independent variable is always the column variable. So therefore, we are always going to compare column percentages when we assess relationship. In the real world, things will be a little bit trickier because sometimes the independent variable will be your row variable. And indeed, I just might mention as an aside, sometimes it's very difficult to know which variable is the independent and which is the dependent. In our adoption example, it's fairly straightforward. I mean, the outcome could not cause the type of placement. The type of placement could indeed affect the outcome. So therefore, type of adoption is the independent and adoption outcome is the dependent in our example. So then, how do we assess relationship? Two categorical variables in a contingency table are unrelated when column percentages are identical. On the other hand, two categorical variables in a contingency table are related when column percentages differ. Now we'll go on in the next slide to take a look at table 6.1 again, but in table 6.1, percentages are identical. So in the new home adoptions, we had 10% disruptions and 90% stable adoptions, and in the foster family adoptions, these percentages were precisely the same. So the fact that the percentages for new home adoptions and those for foster family adoptions are identical is what makes it the case that there is absence of relationship between type of adoption and adoption outcome. Here you have a look at that table, and here are our percentages, and we're focusing on the column percentages because, and it will always be so, the independent variable is the column variable in our text, so we have 10% and 90%. In this column we have 10% and 90%. In this column we have identical percentages in both columns, and if we had a third column and the percentages were again identical to the first two, it would be the same notion. But because the column percentages are identical, the variables in our sample are unassociated. So here the idea is that new home adoptions and foster family adoptions are equally likely to experience disruption, and by the same token, equally likely to experience stability. It doesn't help to focus on the frequencies, which is to say the numbers. You know, the numbers of new home adoptions are larger than are the numbers of foster family adoptions. So were you to try to focus on the cell frequencies, the numbers, you'd have 10 and 90 and 5 and 45. So the cell numbers don't get at relationship. You need to focus on the cell percentages. And in this text, you need to focus on the column percentages. Now let me just mention before I go further, from this point forward, the contingency tables in this text are only going to report one set of percentages, and that is the column percentages. So in this new table, table 6.2, type of adoption and adoption outcome are associated, and they are associated in essence because the column percentages differ. We can generalize and be a little bit less formal here and simply summarize and say categorical variables are related when percentages differ, and that categorical variables are unrelated when percentages are the same. And let me mention that one doesn't need a contingency table to assess relationship between categorical variables. When percentages are the same, there's no relationship. When percentages differ, there is. So suppose you read that 84% of women versus 73% of men pass a test. This is just simply information you're reading. There's no contingency table. These percentages do indeed differ, and therefore gender and test performance are related. To make a couple more points, there are many different ways to describe relationship between categorical variables. Here I'm focusing on the percentages of women and men who pass a test, but we could have flipped things around and said, for instance, suppose that 16%, 100 minus 84%, 16% of women versus 27% of men fail a test. So we could have focused on failures rather than passes, and we'd be just expressing the relationship in a different way. And whichever way we expressed it, in this situation the percentages differ, and therefore gender and test performance are related. So that concludes, in essence, our discussion of material in the first half, or a little bit more than that, of Chapter 6. We go on in the next video to talk about how do you assess how large a relationship is and what are some particular measures of relationship between categorical variables.